After your alpha release, hopefully you're getting some good feedback from the users, and that feedback should inform what your next steps are. At this point, there are two possible scenarios. Either some of your fundamental assumptions are being challenged, in which case you might end up with a pivot. Or alternatively, if you're lucky and have done your homework right up to this point, some of your more minor assumptions are being challenged, in which case you can address those and move on to a beta release eventually. Let's get deeper into these scenarios. You do a pivot when you were pretty much completely wrong about a fundamental aspect of your problem. Or maybe based on some initial feedback, all of a sudden you identify a huge opportunity in a different aspect of the problem statement that you're working on, something that you were not originally thinking about. More concretely, a pivot is a change in a specific but important aspect of your strategy to get you closer to your vision. For example, you might have originally thought that your audience is individuals, but then you learn that your audience is actually businesses. You should always pivot to a better idea rather than away from a bad idea. In other words, it must be based on data and rigorous observations rather than just frustration. To put it more bluntly, doing a random pivot is a good way not to get anywhere. But a carefully calculated and well-informed pivot is the foundation of successful product development. In fact, since a strategy is just a vehicle to help you to get to your vision, it is very common and expected to have a few pivots along the way. Now let's say you've done all the pivots that you needed and finally are getting some favorable feedback. Now you're ready to move closer to your beta release. In that case, you have moved from the first scenario to the second scenario. Let's take a look at what needs to happen in that case. Just to remind you first, with all the learnings, iterations and pivots leading up to your alpha release and then after that up to this point, hopefully you are solving some variation of the user problem. This might not be the best solution that you have hoped, but at least you have laid the foundations for rapid improvements. As you move on ahead for longer-term validation and use of your solution, there are more aspects that you have to start thinking about, rather than just the bare minimum pipeline that you have created. For the starter, you have to think about the data you're using and your data collection practices. Does your data meet your quality requirements for a long-term solution? Do you have a good way in place for monitoring the data quality over time? Are you collecting and using data in an ethical and secure way? Is the privacy of your users respected? What license is the data you're using released under? What implications does that have for your use? Finally, in today's world, data is a big part of your competitive advantage. Are you collecting the data in a way that will set you apart from your competition? If you're using open source or purchased data, does your competition have access to the same data as you? How can you make sure your data is unique and will set you up for future success? Moving on to the model, is there justification for using even more complex models than what you're using? Do you expect a significant gain in performance or the user experience? Other than that, most probably you didn't develop the algorithm that you're using. Make sure the package or the API you're using allows you for the use the way you are doing it. This is important from a licensing and intellectual property point of view. Whether your use is commercial or open source, check out the terms of use of the corresponding license. Does the typical use cases for your application require interpretability of the results? Does your model support that? If not, what kind of post hoc model interpretation techniques can you use? What is the risk associated with using this particular model that you are? How can that be quantified? How can that be mitigated? Are you using the appropriate and sufficient testing to ensure that your whole pipeline doesn't break every time you change something when you move on to the engineering parts? If you need to use multiple models in production, say one model for each customer segment, or say one model for high-level predictions and one for fine-grained predictions, how are you managing all of these models? If you have multiple container images for various scenarios, how are all of these managed? If your application requires multiple models, how do you switch models back and forth between the production environment and your model management solution? Are you sure your deployed solutions don't leave you vulnerable to attacks from bad actors? Does your service need to be available 24/7, or does it need to be up only sometimes? Can it handle spikes in usage? How often do those spikes happen? Do you need multiple access levels? Who decides that, and how do you set it up? How do you monitor and adjust the performance of your solution from a software or modeling point of view? And how do you continue doing that post-development on an ongoing basis? If your solution has a UI, is the user experience and journey optimized for your target metrics like usage or sales? Is the user experience as simple as it could be? If your solution requires integration into other services and technologies, what is required for that integration? Do you have your APIs documented properly? Do you have your data transfer contracts between all the services negotiated and documented? If your solution sits in a larger business context, what's expected of your solution for integration into the business workflow? Is the end user expected to behave differently as a result of the introduction of your solution? Is that communicated and properly planned? Do they need to be trained to be able to use your solution? And finally, are you collecting all the implicit and explicit user feedback that you need to improve your current feature or enable future product features? As you can see, there is so much to do still before your solution can become viable in long term and before you can move on to your beta release. But you're certainly off to a good start, and all of the groundwork you have done will reduce the risk of the long-term investment that you're making at this point.